Uh, Good afternoon. Welcome to the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Leadership Summit webinar series. I'm Peter Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Conference of Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. The conference is hosting this series to focus on some of the most important issues facing our region so that we can hear from some of our regional leaders, engage with you, and hopefully inspire us to collectively accelerate our work. As you saw, and as you can see on the screen, we are grateful to our many sponsors for helping to make this series possible. We will again display our sponsors at the end of today's webinar. Today's webinar will be focused on the economic development opportunity of carbon. Our moderator, the Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, will first make some introductory remarks and then invite presentations from our speakers. Following that, our moderator will facilitate discussion and questions and answers. If you have a question at any time, please enter it into the questions box on the GoToWebinar interface and indicate if it is directed to a particular panelist or to the whole panel. Our moderator will then pose your questions as appropriate and as time allows. Today's presentation will be recorded, and a recording of today's presentations as well as the slides will be made available on the GSGP website at www.gsgp.org. Today's webinar will focus on the economic development opportunity of carbon. One of the ways that our organization has been working to address issues related to carbon is through our work on the Great Lakes Impact Investment Platform. The platform launched in 2020 and showcases sustainability projects in our region that are externally financed and seeking to provide both a financial return to investors along with the environmental benefits for our waters. The platform now features 36 projects representing about $4 billion US in value, creating significant environmental improvements. We are actively seeking more projects and ways that we can build on our past work to address carbon in new ways. I would encourage you to visit our website at www.greatlakesimpactinvestmentplatform.org to learn more. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Wisconsin Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. Lieutenant Governor Barnes, at this point, if you would like to take control, we look forward to hearing our speakers. Thank you.
Absolutely, Peter. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I'm really excited to be able to participate in this conversation, and I guess I should say moderate this conversation with such a distinguished group of panelists. Again, my name is Mandela Barnes. I currently serve as the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Wisconsin, and no matter how you may look at the issue of climate change, the fact is the world is working in many different ways towards a lower carbon future. This is happening in the public and private sector, but as we all know, sometimes it takes a little bit more of a push to make that happen. And now the drive to decarbonize sectors of heavy industry is an incredible challenge, but it's also one of tremendous opportunity for all of us, especially in this region. And looking at it from that perspective, this panel will focus on how the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region is uniquely positioned to emerge as a winner in tomorrow's economy. We have forward-looking companies like Cleveland-Cliffs that are working to drive down carbon in the steelmaking process. In Canada and in the US, a powerful coalition of business, government, and other partners has launched a new effort to produce aluminum without emitting carbon. Now, across the region, many utilities are finding themselves retiring coal-fired power plants and vastly reducing the carbon footprint of electricity. And of course, our region is also home to some incredible natural resources, such as forests and agricultural lands that can store carbon while protecting the biodiversity and the groundwater. It is, in fact, our natural resources which brings this group together, makes us so unique. Now, today, I'm pleased to moderate this discussion about the economic development opportunity of carbon. We have three excellent speakers, and that's Patrick Bloom, who's the Vice President of Government Relations for Cleveland-Cliffs, Rich Bowman, who's Director of Policy for the Nature Conservancy in Michigan, and Jean Simard, who's President of the Aluminum Association of John Simard, who's the President and CEO of the Aluminum Association of Canada. Now, each of them will speak for about 8 minutes, and we will then invite your questions. So please type them into the question box, and I will moderate the Q&A following their presentations. With that, we'll first hear from Patrick Bloom.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Barnes, for that introduction, and thank you to the conference for the invitation to join this panel today. By way of brief background, Cleveland-Cliffs is the largest producer of flat-rolled steel in North America. We employ 25,000 individuals across 46 operations. Of our 25,000 person workforce, we have 20,000 individuals represented by an industrial union, and we're very proud of our collaborative relationship with all of our workforce partners as well as our unions. Gary, please advance the slide if you would. Cleveland-Cliffs is a fully integrated steelmaker, from raw materials to primary steel making, and even downstream to stamping, tooling, and tubing. So we're a company that really runs the gamut of the steel supply chain. We are the steel market leader in automotive industry sales and quality. What does that mean precisely? So in the United States, the automotive industry consumes about 15 million tons of steel per year. Of those 15 million tons, Cleveland-Cliffs is responsible for the production of 5 million tons. The next largest producer of automotive steels is producing less than 2 million tons. So we're the clear leader in terms of supply to the automotive industry. And as we'll discuss later in the presentation, we're fully committed to our GHG emission reduction goals. As you'll see on the next slide, the operational footprint of Cleveland-Cliffs is largely concentrated in the Great Lakes region. There are any number of historic reasons why that's the case. It largely gets to our reliance historically and on a continuing basis for the Great Lakes in terms of the movement of raw materials and finished products on the Great Lakes, allowing us to take advantage of the natural efficiency associated with waterborne commerce. Today we operate 8 blast furnace operations. Think of blast furnaces as the more traditional steelmaking method involving the consumption of iron ore, coke, and limestone in a furnace to produce iron and subsequently steel. In addition, we operate 4 electric arc furnace mills that rely on steel scrap and steel recycling to produce finished products. In addition, we have a number of upstream raw material operations and as well as downstream finishing and finished component operations. Next slide, please. One thing is clear, steel will continue to be relied on by society, and steel will support the greening of America and the decarbonization of our economy. A few prevailing examples here. With respect to wind energy, there are 130 tons of steel required per megawatt of wind energy. Cliffs, as a leading producer of steel plate, will be integral to the continued development of onshore wind and with respect to the development of wind farms off the American coastlines. With respect to solar power, there are 55 tons of galvanized steel required per megawatt hour of solar. Cliffs is a leading producer of galvanized steel. With respect to the modernization and greening of our electric grid, Cleveland-Cliffs is the last remaining producer of grain-oriented electrical steel in all of North America. GOES, as it's known, is a critical and irreplaceable component used in the production of power and distribution transformers, and therefore will be necessary as we seek to improve and green our grid. Next slide, please. I think it's important to establish a baseline of understanding with respect to steel and its contribution to our national GHG emissions. In the United States, the steel industry contributes about 1% of our national greenhouse gas emissions. That's as compared to a global average of 7% in China, where the steel industry contributes 15% of GHG emissions associated with that economy. Next slide, please. This slide is evidence of why the domestic steel industry is the envy of the world as it relates to the carbon profile of steelmaking. In the United States, as an industry, we produce about 1 ton of CO2 for every ton of steel produced. This graph, this bar chart, depicts the carbon intensity of the other major steelmaking countries and regions of the world. It may not come as a surprise that China produces 2.5 tons of GHG emissions or CO2 emissions for each ton of steel. But what is often surprising to folks is just how emission intensive other leading steel industries of the world are, namely Germany, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, among others. Next slide, please. How does steel stack up against competing materials? You probably remember a number of years ago when the Ford F-150 transitioned from a primarily steel outer body to an aluminum outer body. At that time, there was a prevailing belief that automotive production or automotive producers would continue to migrate in the direction of aluminum. By and large, that trend has not materialized. And given the clear advantage of steel as it relates to the GHG emissions profile of the production process, we don't expect that trend to materialize in the future. And we believe that steel will continue to be the material of choice for the production of automobiles and other manufactured products. Next slide, please. At Cleveland-Cliffs, we're doing our part to further drive down GHG emissions associated with the steelmaking process. We have a public goal to reduce our GHG emissions 25% by 2030. That's over a 2017 baseline. It encompasses both our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. In terms of how this will be accomplished, we're going to rely on proven technologies and innovative fuels to get there. We're going to use natural gas via the direct reduction process, which I'll address here momentarily, and also through direct injection of natural gas into our furnaces. We'll pursue clean energy and energy efficiency projects. We'll continue to explore and advance carbon capture and sequestration in conjunction with our governmental partners in academia, and we will optimize material mix through the incorporation of prime scrap in our furnaces. Next slide, please. Cliffs has already made a down payment, or a significant down payment on the decarbonization of the steelmaking process. In late 2020, we completed a $1 billion investment in a hot briquetted iron manufacturing facility in Toledo, Ohio. Hot briquetted iron is a metallic feedstock used for steelmaking. It is produced in the facility pictured here, and it's produced using natural gas as opposed to coal as a reductant. This produces significant greenhouse gas savings versus reliance on coal as the reducing agent, which is the traditional method of making iron in the United States. It subsequently becomes steel. We will use nearly all of this material in our own furnaces, our blast furnaces and basic oxygen furnaces on the integrated side of the business, and our electric arc furnaces. This will allow us to stretch our hot metal production and will allow us to reduce our consumption of coal in the form of coke in our integrated furnaces, which is one of our objectives in terms of decarbonization. This facility is the most state-of-the-art of its kind in the world, largely by virtue of how new and modern it is. And the facility, I'm pleased to report, is well situated to use up to 70% hydrogen as a reductant and as a replacement for natural gas when hydrogen becomes commercially available. Next slide, please. Just a few days ago, on Monday, October 11th, Cleveland-Cliffs announced an agreement to acquire a company called Ferrous Processing and Trading for $775 million. FPT is one of the largest processors of prime ferrous scrap in the United States. It represents 15% of that market. Prime scrap is the cleanest, highest value scrap available in the market. And our acquisition of FPT and our use of scrap generated by FPT will allow us to optimize productivity at our existing electric arc furnaces and basic oxygen furnaces, will allow us to stretch our hot metal production, and again, allow us to drive down the amount of coke and coal required for the steelmaking process. Next slide, please. Lastly, we have and continue to pursue innovative carbon capture and energy efficiency projects across our footprint. Just a few to highlight here for the group. We have a partnership with the Department of Energy at our Burns Harbor Integrated Steel Mill in Northwest Indiana. We are evaluating the feasibility of capturing 2 million metric tons of CO2 per year from the blast furnaces at the Burns Harbor facility. We also have a number of powerhouse projects. These projects are characterized by our capture of byproduct fuels from coke ovens and blast furnaces. These are gases that otherwise would be flared into the atmosphere, producing greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, we are redirecting those for the production of both thermal energy required in our process and the production of electricity. And these two projects, when complete, will allow us to self-generate 75% of our power needs at both Burns Harbor and Cleveland Works. They're both real win-win projects, and we couldn't be more excited to complete these projects and start capturing these gases for production of electricity demanded by our facilities. Lastly, we have and will continue to partner with our incumbent utilities to procure green power to drive down our Scope 2 emissions. That includes an agreement with DTE to acquire 100,000 megawatt hours of renewable power starting in 2024 and beyond. And that builds on a real legacy of working with our incumbent utilities to drive down the emissions profile of the electricity generation process. Next slide. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. That was a primer on steel and its role in the decarbonization of our economy and our society, and a brief overview of Cliff's efforts to further drive down GHG emissions from our own facilities. I look forward to addressing questions after the other panelists finish their presentations. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Really exciting work going on there. And now we'll hear from Rich Bowman.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Barnes, and I'm pleased to be with the panel today. If we could go to the first slide. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the role that nature plays in helping us manage carbon and the economic opportunities provided by that. I'm here today speaking on behalf of both the Nature Conservancy and our partner in Canada, Nature United. Next slide, please. The mission of the Nature Conservancy and Nature United is simple. It's to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. But getting there is very complex and involves a lot of people and a lot of projects. Next slide. A quick primer for those of you who aren't familiar with the Nature Conservancy. We are, by most metrics, the largest nonprofit conservation organization in the world. We have over 1 million members, have been in existence now for almost 70 years. We currently operate in 76 countries and territories as indicated by the map. We operate in all of the states of the United States and all the provinces of Canada. We've conserved over 125 million acres and have a little over 4,000 staff members in these 76 countries. But one of the important things about our work is that from the founding of the organization, we have based our work upon data, evidence, and science. And we have relationships with literally hundreds of major research institutions around the world. And in addition to that, have over 400 terminal degreed scientists in a number of fields who are part of our staff to help us design and execute our work. And this becomes truly critical because both those partner organizations and our own staff are telling us this is the decade where, in order to avoid the worst potential negative impacts of climate change, we really need to make progress on atmospheric greenhouse gas loads. Next slide, please. I want to take just a minute on this slide before I talk about economic opportunities, because this slide represents how much we need to reduce emissions in order to avoid an increase of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius in ambient air temperatures. And you'll notice that's a big triangle from the business as usual emissions to the global carbon emissions we need to get to by 2050. Within that, there is a green band you'll see that says NCS mitigation. And that's what we refer to as natural climate solutions. And it actually represents the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we can remove from the atmosphere and sequester in our forests, our farmlands, and other green areas, even in our urban areas. Next slide, please. This is a quick map of the Great Lakes Basin. It also includes the upper Mississippi and Red River. And my apologies to our colleagues in Canada. We didn't have a good map readily available with the St. Lawrence Seaway, but certainly the St. Lawrence and the regions of Ontario and Quebec that drain to that become part of this. What this really is designed to show you is that even with the major urban areas that we have in this basin, we still have large amounts of forest and grasslands and agricultural lands, all of which can serve as a carbon sink to help us address carbon change. And the conservation, restoration, and improved management actions that we can take on these lands are the focus of our work at the Nature Conservancy and Natural Climate Solutions. Next slide, please. I want to take just a minute on this slide to talk about just what the potential is. In the United States, we are currently sequestering approximately 790 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. In Canada, it's about 13 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. We have the ability with improved and thoughtful management in the US to increase that to 1.2 billion metric tons per year, and in Canada to 75 million metric tons per year. The important thing to think about with this, because this presentation is about the economic opportunities, is that if we assume a value of sequestered carbon of $10 per ton, by putting in place this improved management, it potentially represents for those managers and landowners billions of dollars of currently unrealized revenue for providing this important service and helping us address climate change. Next slide, please. To get to that kind of management and those kinds of results, we need to scale our management activities on natural and working lands. And the way we scale that to get to those levels of carbon sequestration shown in the last slide are through a number of strategies that we're working on at the Nature Conservancy and with partners, including but not limited to developing technical assistance mechanisms for landowners, developing new financial incentives for those landowners, encouraging our federal governments in both US and Canada to make investments in land management, figuring out ways to take what are now nascent carbon markets and scale them so that they can be meaningful, and working with our states and provinces and our local governments on growth policies that are both good for our economy and also smart in terms of managing carbon. And there remains a huge opportunity here in workforce development for programs that target forestry and ecological restoration, because this work takes intelligent, educated people to execute it. Next slide, please. One of the examples of what we're doing at the Nature Conservancy to try to scale this is something we call our Family Forest Carbon Program. This is a program we are doing in partnership with the American Forest Foundation. And it's based on the fact that in the US, the biggest single owner of forest land are family owners that own less than 400 acres. And one of the challenges they face, if we'll go to the next slide, is that while they own most of the forest land, their ability to participate in forest carbon projects is limited. As you'll see from this, the vast majority of the total acres currently in forest carbon projects are on acreages of 5,000 or more acres. And for those folks that are 500 acres and under, they currently have almost no access to this market. And the reason for that really has to do with economies of scale and the fact that in order to both verify the carbon, to determine how much carbon there actually is, to facilitate the transactions, there become some economies of scale that are very challenging for smaller landowners. And so we're designing programs where we can work with those smaller landowners, aggregate their properties, and then market their carbon as if they're multiple individual properties were one larger property, and then allocate the proceeds among them. Next slide, please. This is a diagram of what I just described, where we work with entities that need to secure carbon offsets. We take those revenues and we create a multi-year financial instrument that then makes the payments to those family forest owners who have made those management improvements on their forest lands to increase the amount of carbon they are capturing and sequestering. Those are verified as being actual stored CO2, which then can be claimed by the corporate entity as a carbon offset, just like they're currently doing, buying carbon offsets directly from larger forest landowners. Next slide, please. I want to end my presentation, and this is one of the most important messages that we believe we can leave with you, by talking a little bit about forest carbon offsets, and specifically recognizing and honoring that there are communities that are currently impacted by emissions, and those communities have great concerns about offsets being used to simply avoid reducing emissions, which means they continue to be impacted. For us at the Nature Conservancy, we believe that in order to successfully work with the private sector in the offset market, that we must first make all feasible emission cuts we can. And Patrick talked about what they were doing at Cleveland Cliffs, and I know Jean is going to be talking about what the aluminum industry is doing. But we need to make sure we've cut emissions first before we seek carbon offsets. We have to mitigate the effects of climate change and the offset, particularly on the impacted communities, and we have to develop a mechanism so that part of the offset revenue goes to do those things. There has to be real improved management of forest farms in urban areas. It can't simply be claiming things for what we've already done. We have to make the system work for us to sequester more carbon. And ultimately, we have to recognize that offsets are a temporary mechanism to support and accelerate decarbonization of our atmosphere and of our climate, when in places where we don't have good alternatives for eliminating emissions right now, but that they're temporary. And eventually we need to get to the atmospheric greenhouse gas levels that are sustainable through the reduction of emissions and the application of new technology. With that, I'm done, and I look forward to our discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And finally, we'll have Jean Simard. You may be on mute.
Thank you. It's an honor for me to be here with you today, sharing a panel with Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, Patrick Bloom, and Rick Bowman. Let me see. Okay. As world leaders, whoops. Do I have control on the slides?
Yeah, we hear you.
No? Okay. As world leaders are converging to Glasgow's COP26 meeting to renew and increase our commitment to decarbonization, our planet is slowly coming out of its pandemic nightmare, looking at constructing a better, cleaner, and more sustainable future. Countries and companies are thus setting their pathway towards a carbon neutral position by 2050. While all options are on the table, from the more classic tree planting and energy reduction and substitution to leading edge game-changing technologies, the distance to the finish line is not the same for all. From Mark Carney's 2015 tragedy of the horizon, defining the risk of climate change for the financial community and governments, to more recent ESG and EESG evolving taxonomies, market movers such as financial institutions, insurance companies, and pension funds are actively redirecting their portfolios in the right direction. Industrial and commercial value chains are being pulled and pushed by multinational and large national groups, as well as new generations of consumers towards a more circular, resilient, and responsible supply chain approach. We're all aware that the post-pandemic economic recovery is accelerating this movement through increased consumer awareness, supply chains restructuring, and governments' eagerness to green up their economies through WTO compliant procurement practices. As we move through this more and more complex world, we again find ourselves in a binary world of haves and have-not, where depending on where you are born, operate, or legislate, the carbon legacy will vary, and so will your options and opportunities. A ton of metal from China weighs the same as a ton of metal in Canada or the Middle East. But when you weigh in the average CO2 equivalent per ton, based on regional energy mix, we see that all are not born equal. Thus, China's export in 2021 of 660,000 tons of aluminum wheels to OEMs and aftermarket customers represents 8.5 million tons of embedded carbon emission. It's carbon leakage at its best. There are, in fact, a privileged few, very few, who do have access to clean renewable energy, strategic minerals and materials for the future, robust industrial ecosystem legacies, world-class research and development capacity, and responsive finance and efficient logistical access to markets. We are of these privileged regions of the world, with metals and minerals required to build tomorrow's car today, with announced investments by our car manufacturers for the production of EVs, critical minerals to sustain the battery chain and other highly valued resources. And first and foremost, well-paid and committed workers and well-educated middle-class communities, all striving to build a better world for the next generations. Eastern Canada has been endowed with access to vast amounts of clean and renewable energy and shares with Ontario a rich geological sector of critical minerals and metals essential to our modern economies and emerging technologies. The Great Lakes area thus finds itself in the middle of the ongoing conversation between the US and Canada as they discuss ways to strengthen the Joint Action Plan for Critical Minerals, to target a net zero industrial transformation, and to support clean energy deployment, including batteries for zero emission vehicles, as well as stationary energy storage. These vast, clean, and renewable hydro resources and those valuable geological resources find their way through the Great Lakes water system to a world-class ecosystem of financial markets, industrial research, and manufacturing capacity as the most dynamic market one can hope for. This is one of the most envied industrial value chains in the world. But there is still so much to do in order to capture the full potential of value chain. Why not marry our desire for a secure, sustainable, and responsibly sourced supply chain with the regional content requirements of a USMCA? Given the growing appetite for responsible production within a circular economy approach, I suggest that we start connecting the dots together to capture the full value of what the sum of all parts represents. As we come out of this global pandemic, the world is asking for us to do more than just be in competition with all the wasted energy and resources it might entail. The world is telling us to be in co-opetition, to make more out of less in order to do things better together. This is the challenge brought about to save the planet, and while it can be highly disruptive, it does bring its own rewards. I will now share with you a story that went from dream to reality, from competition to co-opetition. This is the story of ELYSIS. Industrial production of aluminium started in 1880 through the Hall-Héroult process. Still in use after 150 years, this electrolysis process required to turn alumina into aluminium and is responsible for our industry's process emissions, which in Canada represent 6 million tons a year at a rate of 1.93 tons per CO2 per ton of metal. Since this is the technological threshold, we cannot reduce any further our footprint, which is, by the way, the lowest one in the world. As the story goes, talks about a game-changing technology had been going on for decades, called the Holy Grail of the aluminum industry. The inert anode technology was to replace the traditional carbon anode used in the Hall-Héroult process worldwide. Rumors kept creeping out from China, Russia, Scandinavian countries, and even Europe every once in a while about the Holy Grail being on its way. It sounded like an Indiana Jones movie before its time, up until 3 years ago, that is, when a public announcement was made by no other than Apple, Alcoa, and fiercely historical competitor Rio Tinto about a joint venture called ELYSIS being set up in Canada in order to commercialize by 2024 a breakthrough technology that eliminates all direct greenhouse gases from the traditional aluminum smelting process, instead producing pure oxygen. The ELYSIS process has the potential to reduce the environmental footprint of the aluminum industry on a global scale. After years of independent research, foes became allies through the intervention of Apple, whom had conducted an audit of its material supply chain to map out the potential footprint reduction innovations and convince both companies that together they could go the distance to scale up and deliver. The rest is now history. Both Canadian and Quebec governments have invested into this game-changing development project alongside Apple. The research and development facility is now in operation in the Saguenay area of Quebec, and we should see the Holy Grail come to life in a very near future. In more macro terms, Pittsburgh-based Alcoa joined forces with Quebec-based Rio Tinto, supported by both Canadian and Quebec governments and California's Apple, in order to develop a game-changing technology that will significantly contribute to the planet's decarbonization. This is wealth creation in the making. Money, science, technology, and brain power brought together here in our own virtual Great Lakes ecosystem. In conclusion, I would like to suggest the following. Oh, I've lost control of the slides. Can you take me to the next one? Yes, thank you. In conclusion, I'd like to suggest the following. To paraphrase Francis Napoleon, we should have policies dictated by our shared geography. We need to understand and exploit the synergies between institutions, the private sector, and investors. We need to enable cross-border pollinizing. And finally, develop and use shared circular economy procurement practices to grow our ecosystem. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Really excited to have heard from everybody. I hope the audience has been as informed as I am. So with that being said, I want to bring all the panelists back to the screen. Well, again, thank you so much, and we'll get into some questions. And I guess if I could just kick this off, I would ask, can you all talk about the importance of collaboration between business and government to reduce emissions? Many of you already talked about it during your presentation, but if we could turn this into sort of a conversation in hopes to get some best practices or even some ideas that may not have even been explored yet, especially those in heavy industries. And whoever would like to take that first, please go ahead.
Well, I can pick it up. I think that we have the foundations to work together between governments from both sides of the border and between industry and governments. USMCA is certainly a platform, a very strategic platform that is underused, that needs to be consumed completely by all stakeholders. We have this trade agreement that has been in place for about 2 years now, approximately, and we're really not reaping all the benefits and building from this platform as much as we could. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and that would create wealth for the overall good of both countries and industry.
Yeah, at Cleveland Cliffs, we believe the role of government in decarbonization lies in helping the private sector advance technologies from the research and development stage and the bench scale to the point where they're commercially viable and available. In other words, helping get breakthrough technologies off the ground. I provided the example of our partnership with DOE at our Burns Harbor operation. That's just one example of several partnerships we have with our federal government to encourage the further advancement of breakthrough technologies. We don't believe there is a role for government to play in helping, at least in the steel industry, steel producers capitalize and bring online technologies that have been around for decades, even though they do have a significantly lower carbon emission profile than other technologies. And there's been over the course of recent months, numerous examples of high-profile government subsidies for steelmakers, in close partner trading countries rather, and we do regard those as subsidies. And we believe that the role for government should lie not in helping to capitalize investments in known technologies, but rather helping bring new investments to the market, such that we as a private sector can make investments in those technologies.
Yeah, from the standpoint of the Nature Conservancy, one of the things that we're hoping to encourage governments to think about is how we actually maximize the benefits of these natural climate solutions, and potentially even make our governments co-investors with landowners, where potentially we create programs that provide some financial assistance to landowners to improve their management in a way that increases the amount of atmospheric carbon that's being captured and stored, and then create a recapture provision so that if that landowner decides to monetize that carbon in a carbon market, that original investment by the public entity gets recaptured and is able to be reinvested in other projects, and creates a bit of a virtuous cycle whereby we can really both improve our environment and maximize the performance of these environmental assets in helping us address climate change.
definitely appreciate the perspective. And I guess to even trail off of that, I mean, I would ask, what advice do you have for the economic sectors that are outside of your own, as many others seek to reduce or eliminate carbon from their operations and supply chains, but just may not know the best route to make that happen?
I'll chime in on that, Lieutenant Governor. I mean, the approach we've taken at Cleveland Cliffs, and it's a very conscious approach, is setting near-term goals. So I spoke to our 2030 goal or objective to reduce our GHG emissions by 25%. We're taking that iterative approach because we intend to rely on proven technologies to get there. That's why I talked a lot about the use of hot briquetted iron in our furnaces, the use of natural gas in lieu of coal, because we know those resources are available. We know those technologies are proven. And while we're pursuing those known technologies, you know, we're not standing still. We are working with partners to advance breakthrough technologies that will provide for that next wave of decarbonization between 2030 and 2040 and between 2040 and 2050. So I guess I would urge other private sector partners, you know, to consider that iterative approach where you're relying on known technologies now and also working to advance the technologies of the future.
One of the interesting experiences we've had with the Great Lakes Impact Investment Platform is actually folks who have been coming to the platform with ideas who had never thought before about how they establish what their current baseline environmental performance is and how they measure those things. And that's why what we created was a set of standardized metrics, but while we provide some guidelines, we don't specify the methodology because we want people actually to think about this a little bit and to struggle with it. Eventually, there is going to be a role, I think, for governments, probably at the federal level as opposed to the state level, or maybe even at the multinational level, to settle on what the environmental accounting rules are, so to speak, so that there can be some equivalency of the actions or some comparison of the actions across diverse and different sectors. There's a pretty good understanding of what a ton of carbon is, but I think that there's still a lot of questions to be answered about how you figure out which ton of carbon's coming from you versus which is coming from something else. And it was Jean's presentation related to the embedded carbon of aluminum from different parts of the globe is absolutely illustrative of that challenge.
I'd pick up on that. I think it all depends where you start from in this. So some sectors are more heavily weighted in carbon, all depending where they are in the world, and some companies within those sectors have a heavier carbon weight to carry. So they start from afar, which means that probably the cost going into decarbonization is less for them than for players who have done most of the job, and today they're at the last 20% of it. So it's Pareto's law, and this is where we find ourselves in Canada. We're the poster child of the industry around the world because we have the lowest carbon footprint. But in order to improve, it's 80% of the cost because we have to have disruptive technology, a game changer like ELYSIS, which will cost billions of dollars to implement, to go from low carbon to no carbon. So you have to set, I think the key is to set yourself a pathway through time, as was stated by Patrick. You have to have short-term milestones. You have to have the feeling of success as you progress, but you have to progress, and you have to be able to show that you're progressing to the face of the world, to your shareholders, to your customers. You have to be in movement in the right direction, but you have to set your own pace.
Appreciate all those responses, and we do have one from the audience right now. This is for Patrick, and it says that electric green furnaces have a weak spot, namely the grid availability, and of course is backup diesel power generators. Did you look at H2 and storing it for 100% availability for your furnaces?
That's a reference to hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
I assume, yeah. And I spoke to the availability, the potential use of hydrogen at our direct reduction plant. It's something we're evaluating at other facilities. One of the interesting things about our direct reduction plant in Toledo is, I mentioned during the presentation that our reductant is natural gas. Well, that's not exactly true. It's reformed hydrogen from natural gas. So the steam that you see coming out of the tower is just steam. Well, there are some emissions associated with the process. Once our natural gas gets beyond the reformer, it is really almost pure hydrogen. And that's why that facility is particularly well suited to utilize hydrogen should it become available. And that's something that we are going to continue to evaluate and study, both as it relates to that facility, which lends towards use of hydrogen because of how new it is and how modern it is, and at other facilities, again, should hydrogen become available.
Great, and I guess while you're in the group of answering questions, I asked one more, and that's how are your corporate carbon goals driving emission reductions in the broader steel supply chain? And I guess I'll throw this part in there, do you think that these practices make your operations more attractive to consumers or to people that want to contract with you? And when I ask about the broader supply chain, I mean, both in terms of suppliers and customers, are they, is it just an impact that rests solely within you, or does it reach other people as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is an initiative we're undertaking for any number of reasons. It's the direction our society is moving. It's the direction our governmental leaders are moving. It's what investors expect from us. And frankly, it's what the steel consuming markets demand of us. And, per Jean's comments, this is a movement. It is a movement within our society, and it is a movement within heavy industry. And, steel's challenge is unique because unlike other manufacturing processes, carbon is part of our recipe. It's exceedingly difficult, but not impossible to make steel without carbon. And, we have to continue to advance breakthrough technologies as they relate to use of hydrogen, as it relates to carbon capture and utilization to get there. But it's something we're committed to, both with respect to our 2030 goal and beyond. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the supply chain, we are doing this because it's what our customers demand of us. And it's what customers and steel consumers and metals consumers are demanding of their supply chain partners up and down the supply chain.
Thank you. And I'll toss it to Rich and ask, what can business, government, and organizations like the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence governors and premiers do to ensure that the offsets are producing real carbon reductions?
So there are a couple things that we have to do. The first one is that we have to make sure that the method that we have for both creating and verifying offsets is actually legitimate, and that it is put in place the proper protocols to both quantify and then to verify the existence of the asset. And there are several different registries out there right now. The American Carbon Registry, they go out of my head right now. I believe there are 3. I do think that we're going to find ourselves at a point where we're going to have a challenge with consumers that, as we have multiple registries and multiple different types of voluntary markets that are maybe treating carbon a little bit differently, even if they're all legitimate, they may start to not have consumer confidence, and having consumer confidence is important. The example that I often give to folks is I was originally in the agricultural industry, and 30 years ago, we were just seeing the emergence of organic food, and we had the California Organic Standard and the Organic Crop Improvement Association and the European Organic Standard, and consumers started to say, there are too many standards. We don't know which one is which and which one's good and which one's bad. And ultimately, the industry went to the federal government and said, we need to have one standard, the US Department of Agriculture Organic Standard, in order to maintain the confidence of consumers. And we may reach a point where, again, the organic standard is not a regulatory mechanism, it's a standard that says this is what is acceptable performance. And I think that is the role of government at some point in time, is to say this is what the standard is for a verifiable carbon offset, and that's what will give the American public and the Canadian public the confidence that what we're doing really is legitimate and really is providing a meaningful benefit to the environment.
Thank you for that. And finally, we'll pass it on to Jean to close us out. And I'll just ask, how scalable is the technology to produce carbon-free aluminum? Are there implications for other hard-to-abate sectors that can be employed?
Well, I think this technology is based on, as I mentioned, the hydroelectrolysis process, which is the only technology that has been used industrially to produce aluminum through about 100 years. So it's really focused and geared and tailored to this industry. It's going to take some time to scale it up, and the perspective is within the next, I would say, 10 years, we should start seeing industrial scale implementation of the ELYSIS technology. But we also have to understand that we have to create the manufacturing capacity to manufacture the ELYSIS technology so that it can be implemented into smelting operations. So it's a game changer with all that comes with it. It's like carbon capture and sequestration, which is good for other sectors, which doesn't make sense for us technically because of the dilution factor of GHG in our emissions. So conversely, is this technology, will we be able to use it in other industrial sectors? I don't know, but it will be usable around the world in other either greenfield smelting operations or brownfields, which means expansion of existing industrial plant. But the difference will be greater for hydro-based producers because they will go from low carbon footprint to no carbon footprint, and won't be the same for coal-based or natural gas-based because their scope 1 emissions will remain the same. They won't be impacted because what's impacted is your process emissions. So we'll go from low to no, but they'll go from, let's say, 17 tons to 15. It's not really worth it. So it's going to create a different class of producers around the world.
Well, thank you so much. I truly had a great time moderating this panel. I truly appreciate all your expertise, appreciate all your efforts, everything that you all are doing. And I appreciate this perspective that brings in the private sector, where we have seen a lot of holdout over the past, but we've also seen the private sector lead the way in times where government has failed to meet the moment. So just want to express my deep appreciation to everyone for having me here at the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. Look forward to continued partnership with you all. And I just want to say thank you to John, Patrick, and Rich. And I am now handing it back over to Peter.
Thank you Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor Barnes and panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. This is the last in a series of webinars, and if you have not participated in or watched the recordings of our previous webinars, we encourage you to watch them by visiting our website at www.gsgp.org. There are webinars on water infrastructure, the impact investment platform, invasive species, and maritime transportation. We again thank our sponsors and look forward to continuing our work with all of our partners. As noted previously, a recording of today's presentation, as well as the slides, will be made available on our website. Please feel free to share with anybody who may be interested. Thank you again.